The Crimson Nebula Cantina floated in space where no one ruled and everyone feared to go. But Captain Lisa Monroe had no choice because her people were dying, and she needed help from the worst beings in the galaxy. The metal door opened with a sound, like bones breaking, and Lisa walked inside with her head high, even though her heart was beating fast because she knew that showing fear here meant death, and she had come too far to die. Now behind her walked a figure that made even the killers in the bar stop and stare, because this was not a normal being, but an elf woman with hair like silver water that moved without wind, and on her shoulder sat a dragon the size of a cat, with scales that changed from purple to black like the space between stars. The elf was called Shade, and nobody knew her real name or where she came from, but everyone knew what she could do in battle, because 17 times she had appeared when humans were about to lose, and 17 times she had turned defeat into victory before vanishing like smoke. Her dragon was called Vex, and when it looked at you with eyes like tiny suns, you felt like it could see your soul and know every bad thing you had ever done, which made even the hardest killers look away. Lisa walked to the bar and tried not to show how scared she was, because all around her were beings that had destroyed whole worlds and killed millions without feeling anything, and they were all watching her like predators watching prey. In the corner sat a Zarathi warlord with 4 arms and teeth like broken glass, and he was growling low in his throat, because humans had killed his brother in the war, and he wanted revenge on any human he could find. At another table were 3 cybernetic assassins from the Void Collective, and their machine parts were making sounds as their weapons powered up, because they had contracts to kill humans. And here was one walking right into their reach. The bartender was something that might have been human once, but now had too many eyes and arms that bent the wrong way. And when it spoke, its voice sounded like grinding metal mixed with screams. Lisa reached the bar and put her hands flat on the surface, which was sticky with things she did not want to know about, and she took a deep breath, because what she was about to do would either save humanity or get her killed in the next few seconds. The whole room was watching now, and even the music had stopped playing, because everyone could feel that something important was about to happen. And in a place like this, important things usually ended with bloodshed moved closer, and Lisa could smell something like flowers mixed with lightning and death, while Vex spread his tiny wings, showing patterns that hurt to look at because they seemed to exist in more dimensions than should be possible. Lisa cleared her throat, and the sound was like thunder in the silence, because every being in that bar was holding their breath, waiting to see what this human would do in a place where humans were not welcome. She spoke, and her voice was steady, even though her legs wanted to run, because she had practiced this moment 1,000 times, knowing that showing weakness here was the same as dying. "I'm looking for the one they call the Star Reaper," she said, and the words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment nothing happened, and then laughter exploded from every corner of the bar. But it was not happy laughter, but the sound predators make when they find easy prey. The Zarathi warlord stood up, and all 4 of his arms reached for weapons, because this was too good to pass up. And a human asking for the Star Reaper was clearly insane, and killing insane humans was almost a mercy. But before he could move, Shade stepped forward, and suddenly the laughter stopped, because everyone knew that where Shade went, death followed, and even the Zarathi was not stupid enough to challenge her. "The Star Reaper does not exist," Shade said, and her voice was like winter wind over graves, "but perhaps you need something else instead." Human Lisa turned to look at the elf, and for the first time saw her face clearly, and it was beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers are beautiful, because you know that touching them means death, but you want to anyway. Vex lifted his head and looked around the room, and every being he looked at stepped back, because there were stories about what happened to those who made Shade and her dragon angry, and none of the stories had happy endings. The bartender was pouring drinks with all of its many hands, but its eyes never left Lisa, because humans in the Crimson Nebula usually meant trouble, and trouble was bad for business, even in a place that sold. Deathshade walked to a table in the darkest corner where 3 figures sat, and even in a bar full of monsters, these 3 were different because they felt older than the stars, and more dangerous than black holes. Lisa followed because she had no choice, and behind her she could hear weapons being put away, because if Shade was involved, then this was her business now, and interfering with her business was a good way to stop existing. The 3 figures at the table were impossible to describe, because looking at them was like trying to see the color of darkness or hear the sound of silence. But Lisa tried anyway because she needed to understand what she was dealing with. One looked like it was made of crystal that broke light into colors that should not exist, and when it moved, there was a sound like singing glass that made her teeth hurt. Another seemed to be constantly changing shape like smoke, trying to be human, but forgetting what humans looked like and starting over every few seconds. The third was just shadow given form, and looking at it made Lisa feel cold inside, like all the warmth in the universe was being pulled away. "These are the forgotten," Shade said, and sat down at the table like she belonged there, while Vex curled around her neck, watching everything with those burning eyes. "They fought in the first expansion war." Shade continued, and her words made the air feel heavy, because that war was legend from before humans discovered fire, and nothing from that time should still be alive, but here they were. And Lisa could feel their age pressing against her mind like the weight of centuries trying to crush her sanity. "They have been waiting," Shade said and smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp to be human, and waiting for someone brave enough or stupid enough to give them purpose again. Lisa sat down because her legs would not hold her anymore, and she could feel the eyes of everyone in the bar watching to see what would happen when a human sat with legends. The crystal being spoke first, and its voice was like music made of broken things, and it said that the war humans fought now was nothing compared to what was coming, because the hegemony was just the beginning. The shadow figure leaned forward, and where it touched the table the metal turned black and cold, and it said that behind the hegemony was something older that had been sleeping but was waking up. The shapeshifter stopped changing for a moment and looked almost human before dissolving again, and it said that humanity had one chance to survive, but the price would be higher than they could imagine. Lisa listened and felt hope and terror fighting in her chest, because these beings could help, but she could tell that their help would come with costs that might be worse than defeat. Vex suddenly spoke, and his voice was not heard but felt directly in the mind, like thoughts made of fire, and he said, "The enemy you face is not what it seems, and the hegemony fleets are puppets dancing for a master you cannot see." The whole bar was silent now, because when Vex spoke even the oldest beings listened, and what he was saying was impossible, but in a universe full of impossible things that meant nothing. "There is something beyond the veil," Vex continued, and every being in the bar shivered because the veil was the boundary between real space and the place where physics went to die, and nothing good ever came from beyond it. Lisa felt her mouth go dry because she had come here looking for help with a war, but now it seemed the war was just the surface of something much worse, like seeing a single scale and realizing there was a dragon underneath. Shade stood up, and the forgotten rose with her, moving like they were pulled by invisible strings, and she looked at Lisa with eyes that held starlight and darkness in equal measure. "You came here for the Star Reaper," she said, "but what you need is the truth about why your people are dying, and why the hegemony wants to destroy Earth when there are richer worlds to conquer." Lisa stood too, because sitting while others stood was weakness, and she had shown enough weakness already. And she met Shade's eyes, even though it felt like looking into the heart of a star. "Tell me," she said, and her voice was steady, even though inside she was screaming, because she knew that after this moment, nothing would ever be the same. Shade smiled, and it was terrible and beautiful. And she said, "The Star Reaper exists, but it is not what you think. And finding, it means learning why humanity has been to the stars before and why you chose to forget." The bar erupted in whispers because this was impossible, but Shade never lied, even if her truths were worse than other people's lies. And if she said humans had been to the stars before, then somehow it must be true. Lisa felt the world shifting under her feet, because everything she knew about human history was apparently wrong, and she wondered what else was lies and what other secrets were hidden in the dark between stars. "Come with us," Shade said, and turned to leave, with the forgotten following like shadows. And Vex watched Lisa with eyes that seemed to see through time itself. Lisa looked around the bar one last time at all the beings who would kill her without thought, and realized that going with Shade might be death, but staying here definitely was. And at least with Shade she might learn the truth before she died. She followed the elf inside Shade's ship. Lisa felt like her mind was being turned inside out, because the walls seemed to breathe and the floor was sometimes sealing, and nothing stayed the same for more than a heartbeat, which made walking feel like falling in all directions at once. The Forgotten moved through the chaos like they belonged there, and Lisa realized they probably did because beings that old had probably seen the universe when it was young and wild before physics decided on rules and stuck to them. Shade led them to what might have been a bridge, or might have been the heart of a living thing because the controls looked organic, and when Lisa touched one, it felt warm and pulsed. Like a heartbeat. Vex flew from Shade's shoulder and grew as he moved, until he was the size of a horse and his scales reflected impossible colors that made Lisa's eyes water. But she could not look away because he was beautiful and terrible at the same time. "Sit here," Shade said, and pushed Lisa into a chair that wrapped around her like it was alive, and suddenly she could feel the whole ship like it was part of her body. And the sensation was wonderful and horrible because human minds were not meant to feel in so many dimensions. The ship moved, or maybe space moved, around it because Lisa could not tell the difference, but suddenly they were elsewhere. And through the view screen she could see stars that looked wrong, like someone had painted them from memory, but forgotten what stars really looked like. "We go to the wound first," Shade said, and her voice held sadness older than worlds, because there you will see what happened when humanity first reached for the stars, and why they chose to fall back to Earth. And forget Lisa wanted to ask questions, but the chair was feeding information directly into her brain and she was too busy trying not to scream, because the knowledge hurt like ice in her skull, but she needed to understand, so she endured. The crystal being moved closer, and when it spoke, the sound made the air crack like breaking windows, and it said, "Young human, you think your war with the hegemony is about territory or resources, but you are wrong because this war is about something much older." The shadow figure flowed around the bridge, like smoke with purpose, and where it passed, the lights dimmed, and it said, "The hegemony found something in the deep black between galaxies, and it whispered to them and showed them Earth and told them you must be destroyed before you remember." Remember. What Lisa managed to ask, though speaking was hard when her mouth felt like it belonged to someone else, and her thoughts kept trying to escape in directions that did not exist. The shapeshifter paused in its constant motion, and for a moment looked like a human woman with kind eyes before melting back into chaos, and it said, "You were gods once, but you chose to forget, because the price of godhood was too high." Lisa felt tears on her face but did not know why she was crying, except that somewhere, deep in her bones, she felt the truth of those words, even though they made no sense because humans had never been gods. Shade touched a control that looked like crystallized music, and the ship shuddered. Or maybe reality shuddered around them, and suddenly they were somewhere else, and Lisa looked out and saw impossible things. Before them hung a wound in space itself, like someone had torn a hole in the fabric of reality, and through it, Lisa could see things that should not exist moving in, ways that broke every law of physics she knew. "This is where it started," Shade said, and her voice was heavy with memory as she pointed to the wound that bled colors that had no names, while shapes that might have been alive or might have been pure. Malevolence swirled in the tear. 10,000 years ago your people came here." Shade continued, and they were proud and strong and thought they could master anything, but they found something that mastered them instead. Vex spoke directly into Lisa's mind, and his voice was fire and sorrow as he said, "Your ancestors built an empire that spanned galaxies, and they were like gods because they had learned to transcend flesh and live as pure thought and energy. But something lived in the spaces between. Spaces," Vex went on, "and it was older than your universe, and it was hungry. And when humans found it, they thought they could control it, like they controlled everything else." Lisa watched the wound pulse like a diseased heart, and she could feel something watching her from inside it, and the sensation made her want to run. But there was nowhere to run to in the vastness of space. "They failed," Shade said simply, and the thing they found began to eat reality itself, starting with their greatest worlds and spreading like infection through the quantum foam that connected all things. The Forgotten moved to surround Lisa, and she could feel their ancient minds pressing against hers, trying to help her understand, but human brains were not meant to hold such knowledge, and she felt like she might shatter. So they made a choice. The crystal being sang, and its music was funeral bells made of light, because they chose to fall from godhood, back into flesh and bone and blood because physical forms could not be infected by the thing from between. The shadow figure wrapped around Lisa like cold comfort and whispered. They burned their empire and shattered their technology and fled back to Earth where they used the last of their power to make themselves forget because memory itself had become a weapon the enemy could use. The shapeshifter touched Lisa's hand, and for a moment she felt what it was like to be formless and free before it pulled back and said, "But some of us could not forget, and we stayed to watch and wait, because we knew the enemy would not give up." Lisa understood now why Shade looked like an elf and why Vex was a dragon, because they had chosen forms from human mythology, when they fell from transcendence and kept them as reminders of what they had been. "You are them," Lisa said, and her voice broke because the weight of realization was crushing her as she looked at Shade and saw not an alien, but a human who had lived as a god and chosen mortality. "We are echoes," Shade corrected, and there was infinite sadness in her eyes as she gestured to herself and Vex and the Forgotten. "Because we are what remains of humanity's first expansion, and we have waited so long for you to be ready." Ready for what Lisa asked, though. She feared the answer because nothing about this felt like something she wanted to be ready for. Vex flew to her shoulder, and his weight was comforting, even though his claws were sharp, and he said, "Ready to fight the war your ancestors could not win because the sleeping death has found you again, and this time there is nowhere to run." Through the view screen, Lisa could see the wound in space pulsing faster, like it could sense their presence, and things that might have been tentacles, or might have been pure entropy reached through testing the boundaries of reality. The hegemony woke it. Shade explained and moved her hands over controls that responded to thought more than touch, while the ship prepared to flee, because even gods feared what lived in the wound. They were searching for weapons in the deep black, the crystal being added and its light flickered with fear, which seemed wrong because how could something so ancient be afraid? "They found the traces of your old empire," the shadow figure continued, "and followed them to the prison where the sleeping death waited because your ancestors could not kill it, only trap it. And now it whispers to them the shapeshifter finished and tells them that humanity must die before you. Remember how to become gods again because gods might find a way to kill what cannot die." Lisa felt the chair release her, and she stood on shaking legs because understanding was one thing, but accepting was another. And she was just a soldier. Not someone equipped to deal with cosmic horror and ancient enemies. "Take me back," she said, then stopped because back where exactly could she go? Now that she knew the truth about everything. Shade smiled, and it was almost gentle as she said, "There is no back anymore, only forward, and we need to find the others who remember because 7 of us are not enough to fight." "What comes?" Others, Lisa asked, and felt hope for the first time since entering the impossible ship. Because if there were others, then maybe humanity had a chance. Vex nuzzled her cheek with his scaled head, and his voice was warm in her mind as he said, "When humanity fell, some chose different forms and different roles, and they are scattered across the galaxy waiting for the call to wake." The Star Reaper, Shade said, and turned the ship away from the wound which seemed to pulse with anger. "At their leaving is the greatest of us because she chose to become a weapon instead of a person, and she has been sleeping in the dark, waiting for the war to begin again." Lisa thought of her fleet dying in battles they could not win against the hegemony, and realized that everything she had thought important was just the surface of something infinitely worse, like worrying about a paper cut while bleeding from an unseen wound. "Where is she?" Lisa asked, because even if the Star Reaper was more weapon than person, they needed all the help they could get against something that had defeated gods. Shade laughed, and it was the sound of stars dying, as she said, hidden in the last place anyone would look, because the best place to hide a weapon that can kill gods is inside something everyone thinks is harmless. The ship twisted through dimensions that made Lisa's stomach rebel, and suddenly, they were in normal space again. But the stars were different, and she knew they had traveled impossible distances in heartbeats. Before them floated a human colony ship from the early expansion era, and it looked ancient and broken, drifting like a ghost through the void between stars, but Lisa could feel power radiating from it like heat from a sun inside. "That wreck," Shade said, "sleeps the one who chose to become." The corridors of the derelict ship were wrong in ways that made Lisa want to close her eyes. But closing her eyes made it worse because then she could feel the wrongness crawling on her skin like invisible insects made of mathematics. Shade moved through the twisted passages like she had walked them yesterday instead of 10,000 years ago, and her silver hair glowed with its own light-casting shadows that moved independently of her body. Vex had grown to fill the corridor, and his scales scraped against walls that were sometimes metal and sometimes something that might have been crystallized time, and the sound was like fingernails on the surface of reality. The forgotten flowed around them, providing light that revealed things Lisa wished she had not seen because the walls were covered in symbols that hurt to understand, and she could feel them trying to rewrite her thoughts just by looking at them. This ship is her body now, Shade explained as they descended deeper into the vessel where the wrongness grew stronger and the air tasted like copper and lightning and the edge of dreams. She merged with it, the crystal being added, and its voice made the symbols on the walls pulse in rhythm, with Lisa's heartbeat becoming ship and weapon and woman all at once in ways that should not be possible. The shadow figure pointed to marks on the walls that looked like claw marks if claws could cut through dimensions, and it said, "She fought the sleeping death here in this corridor, and reality still bears the scars." Lisa touched one of the marks and immediately pulled her hand back because it felt like touching the absence of everything, and her fingers went numb with cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Further in, they found bodies, or what might have been bodies once but were now just shadows burned into the walls like nuclear shadows. But these had been caught in something worse than atomic fire. Her crew, Shade said quietly, and there was grief in her voice, older than civilizations because they volunteered to stay with her, knowing what she would become, and she kept their shadows as reminders. Vex rumbled deep in his throat, a sound like distant thunder, and said, "They were heroes who chose to die so she could become the weapon humanity needed, even though it meant being forgotten by history." The shapeshifter flowed over to one of the shadows and for a moment took its form, becoming a young man in an ancient uniform before dissolving back and saying, "I knew him once when we were both still human." And he smiled as he died. Lisa felt sick, but not from fear, because these people had sacrificed everything for a future they would never see. And now she was walking through their tomb on the way to wake their killer. They reached a door that was not a door but more like a wound in the ship that had been healed into a scar, and Shade stopped before it, with her hand raised like she was afraid to touch it. Beyond this point, Shade said time and space mean nothing because she made herself into a paradox that exists in all moments simultaneously, so she could fight an enemy that exists outside of time. Lisa did not understand, but she was getting used to not understanding, and she realized that understanding might be dangerous anyway because human minds had limits for good reasons. "Will she remember you?" Lisa asked, because the thought of meeting something that used to be human but had become a weapon was terrifying enough without wondering if it retained any humanity. Shade smiled, and it was sadder than tears as she said, "She remembers everything because forgetting would be mercy." And she denied herself that along with everything else that makes existence bearable. The scar door opened without anyone touching it, and beyond was darkness so complete it seemed solid, but they walked into it anyway because there was no other choice. Inside the darkness, Lisa could feel something vast and patient watching them, and she understood that they were not in a room but inside the Star Reaper's mind made manifest lights began to appear. But they were not lights so much as memories given form, and Lisa saw flashes of the war that had never made it into any history book she had ever read, cities made of thought burning as entropy ate them from within, and beings of pure energy screaming as they were pulled into something that existed in the spaces between existence, fleets of ships that could dance between dimensions being crushed by tentacles of pure void that reached through from places where physics went to die a woman, with eyes like dying stars standing at the heart of a machine that should not exist, saying goodbye to everything she was, so she could become everything. Humanity needed. Sister Shade called into the darkness, and her voice echoed in ways that suggested the space was both infinite and impossibly small at the same time. The memories froze, and then shattered like glass, and in the center of the darkness, something began to unfold like origami made of space-time and nightmares. What emerged was not human anymore, but it remembered being human, which somehow made it worse. and Lisa had to fight not to run as the Star Reaper manifested before them. She was beautiful and terrible, like a storm made of glass and starlight with edges that cut reality just by existing, and where she touched the floor, existence itself recoiled. Her form shifted constantly between states of matter and energy, and sometimes she was a woman with skin like deep space, and sometimes she was a weapon that could unmake suns, and sometimes she was both, and neither shade, the Star Reaper said, and her voice was the sound of civilizations ending and being born in the same breath. Why have you woken me when the war is not yet ready to be won? Because the sleeping death stirs, Shade replied, and stepped forward unafraid. Even though being near the Star Reaper was like standing next to a nuclear reactor made of concepts, the Star Reaper turned her attention to Lisa, and being looked at by her was like being dissected by mathematics, and Lisa felt her deepest thoughts laid bare and examined. This one is young, the Star Reaper observed, and reached out with a hand that was sometimes flesh and sometimes the heat death of the universe to touch Lisa's face. Lisa did not flinch, even though the touch felt like being rewritten at the molecular level, because showing fear now would be admitting that humanity was not ready for what was coming. She has potential, Vex said, and moved to stand beside Lisa like a guardian, even though they both knew he could not protect her from something that had been designed to kill concepts. The Star Reaper laughed, and it was the sound of black holes singing as she said, "Potential means nothing against an enemy that exists outside the boundaries of what is possible. Then teach her," the crystal being suggested, and its light painted new patterns on the walls that looked like equations solving themselves. "Make her understand," the shadow figure added, and wrapped around Lisa like armor made of darkness that provided no protection, but showed solidarity. "Show her what we face," the shapeshifter said, and became a mirror, reflecting the Star Reaper's true form, which was something Lisa could not process, so her brain simply refused to see it, the Star Reaper considered, and while she thought Lisa could feel reality holding its breath, because when weapons that could kill gods made decisions, the universe paid attention very well. She said finally, and suddenly they were not in the ship anymore, but floating in a space that existed between dimensions, where the rules were more like suggestions. "Look," the Star Reaper commanded, and showed them visions that should not exist but did anyway. The sleeping death in its full horror, a thing that was not alive or dead, but something worse that existed in the spaces between thoughts and fed on the concept of existence itself. Civilizations across the galaxy receiving whispers that taught them to hate and fear humanity, because the sleeping death needed agents, and it was so much easier to corrupt than create. The hegemony fleets were just the beginning, because behind them came species that had been turned into weapons aimed at Earth, and they did not even know they were being used. And worst of all, Lisa saw what would happen if humanity lost, because the sleeping death did not just want to destroy humans, but to unmake the very concept of them from reality. When the visions ended, they were back in the Star Reaper's chamber, and Lisa was on her knees without remembering falling, and her nose was bleeding from trying to process information that human brains were not meant to hold. "Now, you understand," the Star Reaper said, "why I became this thing, because only a paradox can fight something that should not exist, and only a weapon can kill what cannot die. But you are not enough alone," Shade said, and there was hope in her voice for the first time as she helped Lisa stand on shaking legs. "No," the Star Reaper agreed, and began to shrink into something almost human-shaped, though she still hurt to look at directly, "and that is why we need to wake the others." "Others like you?" Lisa asked, and was not sure if the answer would be comforting or terrifying. "Different," the Star Reaper said, and began walking toward the exit. Though walking was not the right word for how she moved through space, each of us chose a different aspect to embody, she explained as reality rearranged itself to accommodate her passage, because I became destruction, but others became creation, or preservation, or change. The forgotten began their singing again, and this time Lisa could almost understand the words, which spoke of a gathering storm and a final battle and choices that would echo through eternity. How many, Vex asked, and his mental voice was calculating odds that Lisa did not want to know. 7 great ones, the Star Reaper answered, though many lesser chose forms between mortal and god, and they too must be found if we are to have any chance. They emerged from the derelict ship into Shade's vessel, and Lisa noticed Earth hung in space like a blue marble wrapped in clouds and light. but around it gathered shadows that had teeth and purpose as the hegemony fleet emerged from hyperspace, in numbers that defied counting. Lisa stood on the bridge of the Star Reaper, which was no longer pretending to be a simple ship, but had revealed itself as something between vessel and entity, with walls that breathed and weapons that existed in dimensions humans had no names for. Beside her stood the seven who had once been gods and chosen to fall, each wearing forms that barely contained the power within them. Like nuclear reactors wrapped in human skin shade commanded the tactical display that showed reality from angles that should not exist, while Vex had grown to his true size, filling half the bridge with scales that reflected probabilities instead of light. The dreamer floated nearby, her eyes closed as she wove nightmares into shields, because the best defense against horror was horror itself turned outward, and she had been sleeping for so long that her dreams had gained weight and substance. The Keeper of Forms stood perfectly still, but Lisa could see her cycling through every shape humanity had ever imagined becoming, because she was possibility itself given flesh, and she would need every form for what was coming. The Burning One radiated heat that was not physical but conceptual, the warmth of stars being born and dying in endless cycles, and where he looked, space itself caught fire with potential. The voice sat in silence that was louder than screams, because she had given up sound to become the space between words where meaning lived and died and was reborn. The Guardian existed in multiple states simultaneously, protecting every possible future where humanity survived, and Lisa could see through her how thin those possibilities were becoming. And the Star Reaper herself stood at the center like the eye of a storm that could unmake galaxies. And she was smiling because finally, after 10,000 years, she had a worthy opponent. The hegemony believes they come to destroy Earthshade said, as her hands danced over controls that responded to will more than touch. But they are wrong. They come to open the door, Vex added, his mental voice heavy with ancient knowledge, so the sleeping death can enter reality fully and feast on the concept of humanity itself. Through the view screen, Lisa could see the hegemony dreadnoughts positioning themselves in formations that hurt to perceive, because they were designed not for physical battle but for conceptual warfare. Each ship was a prayer to entropy made manifest, and their weapons were not lasers or missiles but doubts and fears given form and aimed at the heart of human existence behind them. Lisa ordered, and her voice carried new authority because the Star Reaper had been teaching her in dreams that felt more real than waking comes something worse. The sensors showed it then, and every being on the bridge, even the former gods, drew breath, because behind the hegemony fleet reality was developing cracks. Through those cracks oozed something that was not matter or energy, but pure negation, and where it touched normal space existence itself began to dissolve. The sleeping death wakes, the dreamer whispered, without opening her eyes, and sends its fingers through the puppets it has made. Lisa felt her new understanding burning in her mind like fire, because the Star Reaper had shown her what she could become, if she was willing to pay the price. Not yet, the Star Reaper said, reading her thoughts, because there are rules to this dance, and we must follow them or risk losing everything to Paradox. The first wave of hegemony ships fired, and their weapons were not meant to destroy matter, but to delete the very idea of Earth from the universal consciousness. The Guardian split into 1,000 versions of herself, each one intercepting a different attack and dying, so that reality where Earth existed could continue. But she reformed instantly, because that was her nature, to die endlessly, so others could live. And Lisa understood that this was the price of her godhood. The Burning One laughed, and it was the sound of supernovas as he reached out and touched the nearest hegemony dreadnought, which immediately began to burn with fires that consumed not metal, but the concept of opposition. The voice opened her mouth, and silence poured out like a wave that made the hegemony crews forget why they were fighting, and some ships simply stopped as their pilots lost the words for war. The Keeper of Forms became a virus that infected reality itself, spreading through the enemy fleet and rewriting their shapes into things that could not hold together, because form was her domain and she was denying it to them. But for every ship they destroyed, 2 more emerged from hyperspace, because the sleeping death had whispered to species across the galaxy, and they all came believing they were saving existence from humanity. Lisa watched the battle unfold in dimensions her human eyes could not fully process, so her brain filled in the gaps with metaphor and meaning. She saw Shade dancing between states of being, her silver hair cutting through attacks that tried to erase her, while Vex breathed flames that burned backward through time, destroying enemies before they arrived. The dreamer finally opened her eyes, and nightmares poured out like a flood of impossible things that ate fear and excreted madness, and where they passed, enemy ships forgot how to exist. The Star Reaper had not moved yet because she was waiting for something, and Lisa could feel the anticipation building like pressure before a storm. Then it came, and reality screamed because the cracks behind the hegemony fleet widened and something began to push through that was so wrong that existence itself tried to flee. The sleeping death in all its terrible glory, not entering their dimension but reaching through with appendages that were made of pure negation, and wherever they touched things did not just die but never were. Now the Star Reaper said, and her smile was terrible, as she began to unfold from her almost human shape into something that made Lisa want to close her eyes forever, but she kept watching because she needed to understand what humanity had been and could be again, if they were willing to pay the price in sanity and suffering. The Star Reaper became a paradox wrapped in destruction, and she moved not through space but through the concept of space itself, arriving at the cracks in reality before she left. Her weapon forms were not things that could be described, because they existed in states that language had no words for. But Lisa tried anyway, because someone should bear witness. She saw blades made of endings that cut through the very idea of cutting, and guns that fired bullets of pure causality that made their targets never have existed in the first place. The sleeping death's appendages met the Star Reaper's assault, and reality wept as two impossibilities tried to deny each other existence in a battle that took place across all possible timelines simultaneously. Around them the battle continued because the hegemony fleet still came, and behind them more species arrived, drawn by whispers that promised them safety if they destroyed humanity. First, Lisa felt the moment approaching when she would have to choose, and the weight of it was crushing her, because the Star Reaper had shown her the price to fight beings that exist outside reality. You must step outside reality yourself, she had explained in Dreams of Fire and Void. But stepping out is easy, while stepping back is impossible. You will save humanity by becoming something that is no longer human. The dreamer had added her voice soft with the weight of experience, and you will spend eternity defending them from threats they can never know exist. The Keeper of Forms had shown her all the shapes she could take, each one further from mortality than the last, until at the end, she was looking at something that had no connection to humanity except memory. But Earth was dying, and the fleet she had come from was being erased, not destroyed, but edited out of existence, and she could feel people she knew disappearing like they had never been. Choose, the voice said without words, directly into her mind, because the moment is now, and will never come again. Lisa looked at Shade, who nodded sadly because she understood the weight of this choice, having made it herself 10,000 years ago. Vex flew to her side, his true form revealed as something between dragon and concept, and his mental voice was gentle as he said, "We will remember you as you were, even when you forget yourself." The Guardian died another 1,000,000 deaths to buy her seconds to decide, and the Burning One set fire to time itself to slow the sleeping death's advance. Choose, the Star Reaper commanded, even as she fought a battle that existed in no dimension and all dimensions at once, or humanity dies forever. Lisa felt the paths branching before her, and she could see what each choice meant and what it would cost. Not just her, but everyone she would save. If she remained human, she would die, and Earth would die, and humanity would become nothing more than a whisper in the cosmic dark that faded until even whispers were forgotten. If she ascended, she would save them all, but she would never be Lisa Monroe again. Just another god who had once been human, fighting wars in spaces between spaces. She thought of her crew and her family and everyone on Earth, who had no idea that their existence hung on the choice of one woman who had walked into a bar looking for hope. And she thought of those who had made this choice before her and bore its weight for 10,000 years, waiting for humanity to need them again. The sleeping death broke through another crack, and reality convulsed, as more of it entered their dimension, bringing with it the end of all things that had form or meaning. Choose, the assembled gods said in unison, because even they could not make this choice for her, and free will was the one thing that transcended. The war ended not with explosions but with understanding in a place that had once been the Crimson Nebula Cantina. Before reality itself had been rewritten by the battle between gods and nightmares, Lisa, who was no longer Lisa, sat across from the entity that had been the sleeping death but was now something else, because even cosmic horrors could change when faced with the impossible. The cantina existed in a state between states rebuilt by the dreamer from memories and metaphor, where beings that defied physics could sit and talk like mortals. Around them, reality was still healing from wounds that went deeper than dimensions, and sometimes the walls flickered, showing glimpses of the battles that had raged across every possible timeline. You fascinate us, the entity said, and its voice was no longer the negation of all things but something almost curious, as it wore a form that shifted between every fear humanity had ever imagined. We fascinate ourselves, Lisa replied, and her voice carried harmonics that human throats could never produce because she had become something that existed in frequencies beyond sound. The war had lasted seconds and millennia, depending on how you measured time, when time itself was a casualty, and both sides had discovered something neither expected. The sleeping death had fed on civilizations for eons longer than universes had existed, but it had never encountered a species that chose to fall from godhood, only to choose it again. And in that choosing lay something it could not digest or deny, because the weight of that choice created ripples in reality that even entropy had to respect. Your species alone chose mortality when offered eternity. It observed, and its form solidified slightly into something almost human, as if trying to understand by mimicking. Not chose, Lisa corrected, as memories of who she had been surfaced like bubbles in oil, but remembered why eternity without growth is just another form of death. The other gods who had been human gathered around the table, each bearing scars from battles fought in dimensions that had no names. Shade looked older, though age meant nothing to beings like them, and her silver hair moved with breezes that blew in from other realities. Vexing had returned to his small form, but his scales now showed glimpses of every battle ever fought, and every battle that might yet be. The Star Reaper sat perfectly still, because she had fought the hardest battle, holding the line, while reality itself tried to collapse. The dreamer smiled, because she had seen how this would end in visions that came from beyond time, and had known that understanding was the only victory that mattered. The Keeper of Forms existed in every possible configuration simultaneously, showing all the shapes the conversation could take. The Burning One radiated warmth that was not heat but hope, because even gods needed something to believe in. The voice spoke without words, filling the silence with meaning that transcended language, and the Guardian died and lived and died again, protecting every moment of this fragile peace. We could continue fighting, the sleeping death said, and gestured at the scars in reality that showed how close they had come to unmaking everything. We could. Lisa agreed and leaned back in a chair that existed because she believed it did. But what would be the point when we have both already lost? The entity that had been cosmic horror tilted its head in a gesture so human it was disturbing, and asked, "What do you mean?" "We gave up humanity to fight you," she explained, and gestured at her form that was sometimes solid and sometimes pure concept, "and you gave up being unknowable to understand us." Shade added, her voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of waiting and becoming what we needed to be to fight each other. Vex said mentally, "We became something new that neither of us intended." The sleeping death considered this, and its form stabilized further, becoming almost entirely human in appearance, though its eyes still held depths that could swallow galaxies. "You chose to fall from godhood twice," it said, and there was something like wonder in its voice, once by choice and once by necessity, and both times we chose to rise again. The Star Reaper said, speaking for the first time since the battle ended, because that is what humans do. We fall. The dreamer added, and we rise and we fall again. But each time we carry forward what we learned, that is evolution. The Keeper of Forms observed, becoming a mirror that showed the sleeping death its own transformation. The entity looked at its reflection and saw not the cosmic horror it had been, but something new that had been changed by contact with human stubbornness. Your species infected us, it said. But there was no anger in the words, only a kind of bemused acceptance. With hope, the Burning One suggested, and his flames danced with colors that had never existed before. With choice, the voice said silently, and the word echoed in dimensions, where sound was solid, with the radical idea that existence could be more than just continuation. The Guardian added dying and being reborn between words. Lisa felt the moment balanced on a knife edge, because this was where everything would be decided, not through battle but through what came after. We offer you something new, she said, and held out a hand that existed in states that defied counting. The sleeping death looked at the offered hand, and then at the gods who had been human, and then at the scars in reality that showed the price of their war. What the entity asked, though. Lisa sensed it already knew the answer. Partnership, she said simply, and the word carried weight that made reality ring like a bell, instead of destroyer and destroyed. Shade explained. Instead of predator and prey, we offer something neither of us has tried. Coexistence. Vex rumbled and spread wings that cast shadows in dimensions humans had no names for. The sleeping death laughed, and it was not the sound of ending things but something almost like joy. If joy could be made of entropy and starlight, you would trust us, it asked after feeding on civilizations, since before your universe cooled. No, Lisa said honestly. But we would try because the alternative is eternal, war that neither of us can win. And in trying, the Star Reaper added, we might become something greater than either of us alone. The entity considered, and while it thought, reality held its breath, because this moment would echo through every possible future. Then it reached out with a hand that was almost human and took Lisa's offered grip, and where they touched, new possibilities bloomed. The contact was electric and terrifying and wonderful, because two forces that should have destroyed each other were choosing not to. Around them, the cantina solidified, becoming more real, as if the universe itself approved of this impossible alliance. We accept, the sleeping death said, and its form finally settled into something that could sit at a table and share drinks with gods. But there are conditions, Shade warned, because there are always conditions when powers like us make pacts. The entity nodded, because it understood the weight of what they were attempting and the price they all would pay. You will guard the boundaries, the dreamer said, showing visions of spaces between realities where threats waited that made the sleeping death look tame. We will teach you to build instead of only consume, the keeper of forms offered, becoming a blueprint for creation rather than destruction. You will help us protect not just humanity but all species that choose growth over stagnation. The Burning One added, his flames warming rather than destroying, and together the voice concluded, without words, we will face what comes next as allies rather than enemies. The sleeping death considered, and then smiled with a face that was almost human, showing teeth that were only slightly too sharp. We agree, it said, and the pact was sealed with handshakes that rewrote the fundamental laws of reality. Around them, the universe exhaled in relief because the war was over, not through victory but through something harder, which was understanding. But we cannot stay like this, Lisa said, gesturing at their god forms, because humanity needs protectors who remember what it means to be human. The others nodded because they had learned this lesson before and would learn it again as many times as necessary. So, we will fall again, Shade said, but this time, not in defeat, but in wisdom. We will return to mortality. The Star Reaper agreed most of the time and rise only when needed. The sleeping death watched this with something like amazement, because even after everything it could not understand, choosing to be less. That is why we survived, Lisa explained, reading its confusion, because we remember that power without purpose is meaningless, and purpose comes from connection. The dreamer added, from understanding what it means to be fragile. The entity nodded slowly, beginning to grasp what made humanity unique among all the species it had consumed. You will teach us, it said, and the request was genuine, because even cosmic horrors could learn. We will try, Lisa promised, and stood from the table that existed in a place between places where impossible things became possible. One by one, the gods who had been human began to diminish, returning to mortal forms. Though they kept the memory of what they had been, Lisa felt herself condensing from cosmic awareness back into flesh and bone, and it was like trying to pour an ocean into a cup, but she managed because humans were good at impossible things, and when she opened her eyes, she was Captain Lisa Monroe again. Around her, the others had also returned to mortality, though. They all carried a glow that suggested divinity sleeping just beneath the skin. The sleeping death watched them shrink and asked, "Will you not be vulnerable like this?" "Yes." Shade answered and smiled. "Because that is the point. Vulnerability breeds strength," Vex added, now small enough to perch on her shoulder again. "And strength breeds compassion," the Star Reaper said, though she kept